In this week's video, I'll be showing you how I throw and trim some very simple side plates. I'll also discuss some simple tips and tricks that I've been taught over the years, although I always feel as if I learn so much every time I make a batch of these. I think flatware can be surprisingly challenging, so I hope this video provides you with some insight from my practice. First and foremost is the condition of the clay. For flatware, it really does help to have very soft clay. This is some particularly wet stoneware that I've saved just for making some plates. I want soft clay because primarily all I'm doing with it on the wheel is squashing it down into a large, flat disc. Plates generally aren't very complicated shapes, so we don't need the firmness that's often useful for when you're throwing taller, more complicated vessels. And in actuality, using very firm clay can be a hindrance when making plates, as squashing it down becomes much more difficult, and it needn't be. Soft clay really makes such a difference. Currently being wedged is a high iron stoneware clay body. The pink-red hue simply comes from the amount of red iron oxide the clay contains, and it's a body that's intended to be reduction fired in a gas kiln. At least that's when you'll see most of its character. When fired in an oxidized atmosphere, it sort of comes out as a dull grey, but when heavily reduction fired, it's warm and toasty, and is speckled with thousands of tiny specks of iron. Anyhow, once really well spiral wedged, which is this process of kneading you've seen me doing, which removes all the air pockets and any hard consistencies that might be in the clay, it's time to get started. And first, I throw a very simple clay batt on the wheel. This isn't the plate, this is simply a thin skim of clay which I throw beforehand. It acts as a sticky layer which I'll later be able to attach my wooden MDF throwing bats onto. But essentially, all it is a 1 centimeter thick or so pad of clay, which I then scrape clean of slip before blasting it with a heat gun so that it turns leather hard. I then give it a very slight trim if it needs it, just to make sure it's perfectly flat, and that's it. Then it's time to weigh out the clay for the plates. Each one here weighs 1.5 pounds, which is 680 grams. This initial weight is quite large, as the plates I make will have foot rings trimmed into the bases, which means I need to leave an excessively thick base on these pots when I throw them, compared to say if I was making plates without them. Once the clay is weighed out, I give each one another spiral wedge. This is a more difficult process to do on smaller lumps of clay, but essentially my hands are still doing the same 2 motions. And I do this just to make sure that all those weighed out pieces are really homogeneous and that the ball of clay is completely even and smooth. Although thankfully for plates, air pockets aren't the worst thing. Of course I want to remove as many as possible, but as I'm squashing down the clay to form the plates, air bubbles are very easy to remove just with a simple prick of a needle, and they aren't nearly as destructive as they can be when you're throwing taller, thin, and more delicate vessels. So, let's get throwing. I start by just putting a tiny amount of water onto the clay bat. The MDF bat is then placed on top and tap centered into place before being squashed down a few times like so, which is usually enough to keep it firmly secured in place. I then take the soft lump of clay, slam it down into the middle, and begin to center. During this process, I'm leaning my upper body weight onto my arms, and I'm also interlocking my hands, whilst also bracing my arms on the plastic of the wheel tray. Essentially, I'm trying to keep my body and my arms as rigid as possible. I then cone the lump up and down a few times, just to make sure that all the clay particles are really aligned, and this also acts as basically another form of wedging, but on the wheel. And I think for flatware especially, compression and centering and coning up and down is essential, as it all helps to prevent S-cracks from occurring. I thought it's probably worth including this footage, which shows me adjusting my throwing pointer to the rim of my plate. This is something I do after I've thrown the first piece. In this instance, these side plates are 20 centimeters across and 3 centimeters tall. And initially, I just measure these dimensions using a ruler, and then, once I'm happy with them, I move my arm and adjust it so that the rubber pointer meets just at where the rim is. This then gives me a point in space in which to aim for as I'm throwing, which is incredibly useful. Anyway, let's get back to throwing. You can see that my rubber pointer is coming in from the right here, so that's the point I'm aiming for. And once I've flattened down the lump of clay enough, I then start to draw the clay outward from the middle so that I can begin to form the outer flange of the plate. This drawing out of the clay also helps to compress the base even more. And then Once I have enough clay to work with on the outside, I can begin to throw the outer wall, which, once it's at the correct height, I can lower the wall outward so that it comes to meet my throwing gauge's pointer. I should note, I throw these on wooden bats so that when I'm finished making them, I don't have to just lift away the plate itself. Instead, I can lift the bat with the plate on top of it, and thus nothing gets distorted in that process. Once the shape is more or less there, I sponge away the excess slip and water, and then I can begin the procedure of cleaning up the form. For this, initially, I use a flat edge tool. It could be wooden or metal or rubber, it really doesn't matter. But I find this blue Mud Tools kidney does the job nicely. I'm not really pushing down too hard, as I don't want to make the base of the plate any thinner. Instead, I'm just trying to compress the clay and make it nice and flat. I'm not too concerned if there are a few tiny marks left, as I can always trim those out later, and eventually my glaze will cover them too. I then do the same to the outer flange, scraping away the slip, and the good thing about this throwing gauge is that I can flip the pointer out of the way if it does start to catch on the rim. After a little more tidying up, I then scrape away the slip off of the MDF bat, just to make things cleaner a little bit further down the line. I also wipe the excess away on the edge of the bat just with a finger. Then, I take my wire, and whilst keeping it very taut, I carefully drag it underneath the plate. Keeping the wire totally flat is crucial, as if it does bow up a little bit, it can easily eat away clay that you'll later need to trim the foot ring from. The MDF bat is then carefully pried away from the clay bat underneath, and put it aside. This is the view I see of the plate when I look at the mirror that sits in front of me as I'm throwing, and that little curl of clay, that little lip you can see just towards the bottom of the plate by the wooden bat, actually comes in to be very useful later on, and I'll show you why. Then, once everything's been thrown, the plates are set aside to dry out slowly to leather hard, and slowly is important, as rushing plates to dry is what can cause things to warp and crack and go wrong eventually. The other thing to remember with plates is you don't want to exert too much of a change to their shape. Clay has a memory. If you were to warp the pieces as you flip them over like this too much, it might remember that forever, and as it dries, it'll return to that bowed distortion that you once put upon the piece. For this reason, whenever I'm flipping plates around like this, I try to do so in between two bats. Basically, I'm trying to keep the plates as flat as possible the entire time, and here's why this lip on the bottom of the plates becomes useful. It creates an area which your hands can grasp around and move the plate around without worrying about it bending or warping too much, and it becomes especially useful for when you want to place the plates down on the wheel to trim the bottoms of them. As for the bats, all I do with these is I scrape them clean. I never wash them or soak them in water, as that's what can cause them to warp, and I just make sure that I alternate between using both sides of the throwing bat. Some materials bend more than others. These MDF bats have actually been quite good in regard to warping, whereas some I've used in the past really bend quite dramatically. This clay, like all the trimmings from the plates too, is all totally recyclable, and it'll all be slaked down in water to become a sludge, which I'll then later be able to recycle properly and wedge up into usable clay. Here are some of the tools I'll be using for trimming. First is this little loop tool, which certainly isn't anything special. The metal of it is quite thin, and actually I think I just like the shape of it for trimming fine details. Next is the very useful tungsten carbide trimming tool, which I use probably for every pot I make. Then there's this pointed, very simple tool I got from Japan, which is wonderful for removing a lot of clay very quickly, in a very controlled manner. And then to mark out the diameter, I use my bison potter's needle and my pair of Taranti calipers, which I adore. They're incredibly robust, and I've used them for years. This isn't an ad, by the way. I should probably make that clear for anyone watching. It's simply one of many tools that I've come to love using. So, let's start to trim. At this point, the plate is totally leather hard, and has very little flex in it, so really, it's on the firmer side of leather hard. I start by just doing a touch of trimming on the top surface of the plate. This is done to neaten up and straighten those thrown surfaces, and to further define those lips and edges so that my glazes will react nicely over them. I don't worry about making the surfaces completely smooth and burnished and perfect. I actually quite like the marks and the surface quality left by the metal trimming tools, whilst there are potters who prefer the marks left by hand. It all just comes down to personal preference. Then, once I'm ready to trim the underside, I place down a small pad of foam. This helps to support the base of the plate as I'm trimming it, and it prevents it from bowing inward as I trim it ever thinner and thinner. And in reality, this piece of material could be anything. It could be fabric, it could be sponge, it could be foam, it could be clay. In fact, if I was making many hundreds of these, I would throw a very specific shape that fits into the underside of these, a clay chuck that holds it firmly in place. But for now, as I'm not really producing very many of these, the foam works well. As you can see, I measured the base with my pair of calipers, and I do the same to every plate I trim, just to make sure that their feet are all the exact same diameter. This not only, of course, means they all look the same, but if all the feet are in the exact same location, it means when you stack the pieces, they'll do so more neatly, and the weight from each plate is distributed from foot ring to foot ring to foot ring, which means I can bisque fire them in larger piles, without having to worry about them warping. Once the underside of the outer flange has been trimmed nice and thin, I then secure the piece down with 3 lumps of clay, and begin to trim out the inside of the foot ring. I hold the trimming tool firmly with 2 hands, start in the middle, and gradually and very carefully work my way outward, removing bit by bit as I go. I really try to work as carefully as possible here, as all it takes is one slip to ruin an entire piece. I remove probably about 4 to 5 millimeters from the inside of the foot ring, and I use this trimming tool to do most of the work, as it really lets me gouge away a lot of clay at once. Then, once the rough shape is there, I move on to using my finer trimming tools to turn in some more detail and to trim the foot ring itself totally flat. I then use this very fine, sharp trimming tool just to start from the middle and work my way outward, taking off just a tiny bit of clay at a time. I find that if I use a larger trimming tool and try to remove a lot of mass in very few movements, that often I end up doing something wrong or imparting too much pressure onto the base as a whole and therefore deforming it. So I tend to use finer tools to remove a lot of mass, and then I use a larger tool just to clean things up at the end, like this. This wider blade helps to just even out the surface and to remove all the small incision marks left by the finer trimming tools. I then place a ruler over top just to check the depth of the foot ring, and then I do just a few little final corrections towards the end to make sure things are crisp and neat. All this blowing you hear is simply my attempt at dislodging some of those trimmings that come off and get stuck on the plate. Often it's quicker to do this than to brush them off or try and dislodge them with your hands, but inevitably it ends up being a combination of the two. Finally, once all the trimming work is done, I just use the pads of my fingers to quickly burnish over and soften those sharp edges, and then I stamp the foot ring with my handmade little maker's mark. Pushing this into the soft clay does dislodge a little bit upward, so once I've stamped it, I do need to trim the top just a touch, just to remove the imperfection. And again I give it just one final burnish with my fingertips. Provided that your clay is firm enough, you should be able to just lift it away, like so. And the entire time I'm just being very cautious that I'm not bending the plate and trying to keep it as flat as possible. I then give the rim a quick little burnish with my fingers, and then using 2 batts I flip it back over so it can dry on its rim, face up. And at first I'll keep these wrapped up with plastic to dry out very slowly over a couple of days. Slow and steady ensures that the plates stay nice and flat. And here's the same set of plates, stacked once bone dry, although I wish I had placed that second one just a bit more level, to stop them all from leaning to the left slightly. No matter. The important thing is too, that the gaps between each of the rims, the shadowy depths, are more or less the same from pot to pot. And here's how I pack them in the electric kiln to be bisque fired. Generally, I won't do a stack that's higher than about 6 plates, and for larger dinner plates, it's even less than that. But as long as they're stacked neatly and the foot ring of each is leading onto the other, I haven't had any problems firing them this way. Yet. We all know how unpredictable ceramics can be, and eventually something somewhere will go wrong. But for the time being, I'll just keep on going like this. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch. And if you'd like to see a few finished, fired examples, stick around until the end.